Friends, good morning. It is my distinct privilege to convene this session on ethics, sex, gender, and sexuality. My name is Heather Foucault-Camm, and I work at the Science and Religion Initiative here on campus at the University of Notre Dame. As has become the routine in this past day and a bit, you will hear from each of our four speakers, all right, two of whom will be delivering a joint presentation for a total of 30 minutes. They will use this time as they see fit for both their paper and ideally question and answer as well. And we will conclude on time at 12:20. Our first speaker today, Professor Janet E. Smith, seated to my left, is the retired Father Michael J. McGivney Chair of Life Ethics at Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit. She is writing a response to Father Olivia's Amours. She works on the sexual abuse crisis in the church, dreaming of finishing an introduction to moral theology as well, and a book on taking care of her mother with dementia, and additionally, possibly a book on moral behavior in a time of persecution. Professor Smith will speak to us today on the concept of Complexio and homosexuality. Please join me in welcoming Professor Smith.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. I am retired and I don't get enough academic intellectual stimulation. My friends feel embarrassed when I say that, but anyway, it's true. And I'm glad to meet old friends and see the upcoming hordes of Thomas, which is just terrific, and to see former students, among which is Therese Corey and David Corey. I can take no credit, but I will. I think they're just great. And Catherine Peters here is a former student of mine. I actually met her when she was 8, and she was defeating me at chess. And her father has always reminded me at that time I called her a wretched child. She's not a wretched child. She's fantastic, but that was what she did to me. I have a delicate ego. Being beaten by an 8-year-old is just a little bit too much. Anyway, so I am, this paper is very much a work in progress, though there is an equivocation on the word progress, of course. Progress means it's not done yet. It can also mean you're making progress, which I'm not sure that you're moving forward. I discovered this concept of a complexio, which so far as I can tell is not sufficiently recognized, the place of it in Thomistic thought, especially ethics. And if I'm wrong about that, I've tried to look around to see where it might be treated. I'm not finding a lot of treatment of this topic. So if you find something or you know of something, please tell me. I'm also making some inferences from the text of Thomas that I hope are right. If they're not, again, I prefer to be corrected on this. It's something I don't think has been recognized in Thomas. And again, but why should I be the one to find it? So it makes me a little nervous. I am writing this response to Adriano Oliva's book, Amours, which is, it's a very horrible book. It's scandalous, actually. And I do have to thank many Dominicans who have taken their confrere to the woodshed, as we should say, on this book. Some have written, there was a group of 5 Dominicans who wrote a short response to this book in First Things back in, I think, 2015. And several French Dominicans have written very scholarly responses to him. And I don't know how I got myself into this. It's a story in itself. I'm writing a response. The second half of I'm going to give what I hope will be a fairly briefish introduction, though it may go too long. But I put together texts that I think are essential to this topic. And if I don't get to all the texts, which would be, unless everybody wants to yield their time to me, I don't think it's going to happen, and even that might not be enough. So for you to look at your leisure if I don't get through them today. But the second half of Oliva's book is on the question of homosexuality And he's trying to and it was written subsequent to the first synods on the family in 2014 and 15, where there was a movement to have a recognition of the uprightness of same-sex unions, not necessarily marriages, but some kind of unions. And in his book, he argues that same-sex couples are certainly, there's nothing immoral in them living together. I'm trying to not be too, what do you want to say, derogatory in my remarks, but he gives some lip service, to saying that they must be chaste. But in the end, he says, well, in the Catholic moral tradition, takes into account circumstances of the moral act. And if they should end up having sex with each other, it should not be viewed as a serious offense against God, and maybe even be a good thing as a natural outgrowth of their relationship. So the passage that one of the passages in his book, and this one we'll take a look at, is the passage in the Summa on connaturality and actually unnatural desires. And he gives 3 examples: cannibalism, bestiality, and homosexuality. And he talks about it, he clusters them together. He doesn't give any moral ranking to them, all right? He just says that they all have the same source, which is a corrupt complexio, all right? A corruptio complexionis. Oliva actually translates corruption as altered, all right? An altered complexio. Which has got to be a wrong translation. Corruption means corruption, going from a good state to a worse state. And in fact, Oliva seems to think it's not just an alteration, it's just a different complexio, a different orientation, if you will. In fact, he goes so far to say that God infuses a homosexual soul in homosexual individuals. That's our private nature, our personal nature. We have a human nature with a human soul, but God infuses the homosexuality. Now, he doesn't say anything, of course, about cannibalism or bestiality, that if God has infused those souls into people, he does not, he just brushes those 2 categories aside. So if we can go down to the 3rd paragraph in the first text, it says, and he's talking about natural and unnatural desires. There's disordered natural desires that we all have as a result of original sin, plus, of course, our choices. And then there are unnatural desires. It talks about cannibalism, bestiality, homosexuality. And these, we can expect everybody to want to eat too much, sleep too much, drink too much, etc., or too little in a certain way. But it seems to me both Aristotle and Aquinas would say those who experience a desire for homosexual sex, cannibalism, or bestiality have desires that the rest of us don't, all right? These are not natural to human beings. And we're kind of mystified. Those who don't have these are mystified by those. Why do they have them? Where do they come from? And why do they find them satisfying? Natural desires lead us to something that's satisfying. We can have disordered, but we can also we can order those. Where it is certainly true that we cannot order unnatural desires. There's no order for them. You can't do cannibalism at the right time, in the right way, in the right manner, etc., etc. It's absolutely off the charts as something that is acceptable. So in the 3rd paragraph down, he says, under each kind of pleasures, we find some that are not natural, speaking absolutely, or simpliciter, in some respect. They're not natural in some respect, for it happens in an individual that some one of the natural principles of the species is corrupted, not just altered, corrupted, so that something which is contrary to the specific individual becomes accidentally natural to this individual, right? So it's not that God infuses a soul, which would be a part of our substance, but it's accidentally natural to an individual. Consequently, it happens that something which is not natural to man, either in regard to reason or in regard to the preservation of the body, becomes co-natural to this individual man on account of there being some corruption of nature, all right, in him. And this corruption may be either on the part of the body from some ailment. Thus, to a man suffering from fever, sweet things seem bitter, and vice versa. So, I mean, if we have orange juice and someone's sick, it might taste bitter to him, though it's perfectly tasty orange juice. All right, or from an evil temperament. And again, malum here, of course, could be not a moral category. It could just be a ontological category. So we have to be a little bit careful about that when he says a malum complexionum, one that doesn't have the perfection of the being of something participates in malum. All right, so some take pleasure in eating earth and coals and the like. So here the complexio seems to be spoken of as a physical thing. All right, you have a physical malady that causes you to want to do things that other human beings don't want to do, eat earth and coal and the like. But the complexio, the malum complexio, can also be on the part of the soul, all right, thus from custom. Right? Some take pleasure in cannibalism or in the unnatural intercourse, coitus, of man and beast, or other such things which are not in accord with human nature. So as I was reading this and dealing with Oliva's interpretation, I get all bent out of shape because he's translating corruption as alteration rather than corruption. Corruptio is alteration rather than corruption. And but then all of a sudden I noticed this word complexio. And I'm thinking, what do I know about that? And I'm thinking, well, at least I don't. I know very, very little about it. And so I tried to, as you know, doing work on anything in Aquinas means you have to go down about 100 black holes, and it's really hard to emerge from any of them because there's so many distinctions that need to be made. And so the general translations of complexio are words like disposition, temperament, constitution, makeup, all right? And it really is it's the complexio, the weaving together of your physical being. It is what individuates you. Each one of us has our own personal complexio, right? We all have a human soul, and that is infused in matter, which affects our psyche. The body and soul are dependent. And the word temperament sometimes work because he is talking about whether you're melancholic or sanguine or, phlegmatic or choleric, which is what I am. Anyway, so, and he talks about these things being influential on your moral life, that because of your temperament, you have a predisposition or a disposition to certain virtues. Phlegmatic, might have a disposition to justice in a sense. They want people to get along. The choleric does, it very zealous for justice and get angry at injustice. And as he talks about this, he has passages in that respect. But I think actually the best word is makeup, that we all are born with a makeup, and that we're not stuck with that. Those who study the temperament say that if you really achieve some sort of, or making progress towards sanctity, people will have they'll be hard pressed to determine which temperament you have, because you've become balanced, all right? You've taken the trouble to, if you're choleric, to become, one hopes in a sense, less choleric, more sanguine or more phlegmatic, which will balance out your temperament. But I'm wondering if we shouldn't just accept the word complexio and with all its complexity and insist people learn a new term for talking about Thomas's thought. So let's see what I got here. So I'm going to go through the passages, if I get there, to what are the sources of this corrupt complexio. Yes, the sources. One is bad customs, that you grow up in a state that shapes you in a certain way. So your makeup can be, you born with one, but as you go through life, your choices can change it. Experiences you have, education, the laws of the state can shape and corrupt your complexio. So if you grow up in a state where, not even a state, a tribe that practices cannibalism or bestiality, you might do that. And again, think it's perfectly natural, right? That's what people do. And other people look at you and say, again, that's barbaric. It's not human. It's beyond the pale. Or he talks about illness, insanity, or some disease that would cause you to have inclinations or tastes or preferences that other human beings who are not sick don't have. And then he talks about something happening to a person. And Aristotle talks about possible pederasty is one of those things that is a source of homosexuality, which the psychological sciences certainly believe now, that young men who are sexually abused might well develop a taste or a desire for homosexual acts, which they never would have had otherwise. And that is, I've sort of immersed myself in the last, 20, 30 years. I've read a lot of homosexual literature of men who have gone from being active homosexuals to not, all right? And every one of them, there's not one who thinks they chose to be homosexual. They say they recognize it at some point in themselves, and they're mystified. I mean, sometimes when they go through psychological counseling, they realize it was because of an encounter they had, an abuse that they had when they were either prepubescent or as a young man, and say, well, that's when I first started realizing or thinking of myself as gay or homosexual. There's a book by a man named Ken Williams, who's an evangelical, and he grew up in a very devout household, and he says how he, as a young boy, absolutely had accepted God as Jesus as his savior. But when he was 8, he and his friends came across a box of homosexual pornography, which he said was unbelievably vile. But being young boys, they acted it out, all right? And he said, and then there were other things. He said he was more sensitive than the other boys, and he liked to talk to women because we don't talk just sports, all right, and cars, but other things. And so he started feeling different, and he never liked it. He never wanted it. And over again, these men in these texts, and it's hard to talk about female sexuality because if you don't know this already, women are more complicated than men, all right? So it's more complicated phenomena. But with males, there's a pattern, and he came to hate himself, and he thought God couldn't love him because God wouldn't have let him become a homosexual, right? And then he decides that God doesn't love him because he does such depraved things, right? So he had to be walked through Scripture by an elder in his church who helped him to see that, yes, homosexuality is not in accord with God's will for homosexuality, but God did not make you a homosexual, and God does not hate you. You're a beloved son of God, and we will help you. His pastor actually said, we don't know what to do about this. It came to his attention. He said, but we're going to help you. And what he did was he gave him a mentor who, over a year, 2 years, met with him on Saturday mornings for breakfast and talked to him about how much God did love him, not as he was as a son of God, but not as he was as an active homosexual. So Thomas talks mostly about this complexio in his commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, right? And Aristotle, as you know, has 4 primary character states: virtue, the person who knows what is good and does it freely and takes pleasure in it. The morally strong person who knows what is good has to fight some temptation, generally does what is right, but sometimes chafes that he has to do the right thing. The morally weak who knows the right thing to do, struggles with temptation, often succumbs to the temptation, and but can regret the choice that he made. And then you get the vicious, who does know what the right thing is to do, but has decided he loves that thing, and it's for him it's good. And he actually, Aristotle actually talks about him as being incurable, all right, because he doesn't regret it. He doesn't regret what he does. Then Aristotle has two states that are outside of what I think he's saying, they're outside of moral judgment, all right? And one state is the divine or heroic person. We would take Mother Teresa, and you say, where does she come from, all right? Who can do that? Who can be that good, all right? She takes delight in doing things that very few of us can even stomach doing, bringing dying people that are infested with vermin out of a sewer and cleaning them up and giving them a beautiful death. There's not too many people that say, well, that's what I want to do. And you can say, yeah, it's a great thing to do, but whoa. Then he has the brutish state, all right? But the word, I'm even going to use the word morally compromised, all right? The morally compromised person. It's the person who has such unnatural desires that they have compromised his reason and his will, all right? The person who's a cannibal or bestiality or homosexual is drawn to these actions that human beings don't do. And he says they compromise your free will. And he says they compromise your reason. Let's go down to 3, which is actually on page 3 at the top. And here he is talking about brutishness, section 296, commentary, top of page 3. He says, in one way, an upset in harmony of this kind, the harmony of natural desires, but can arise without exceeding the limits of human living. Oh, that's vice. Then it will simply be called incontinence, okay, or human vice, like sickness of the human body in which human nature is preserved. In another way, the correct relation in human desires can be so corrupted that it exceeds the limits of a human mode of living, like the inclinations of a dumb animal, a lion or a pig. This is what is called brutishness. It is just as if the temperament of a man's body had been changed into the temperament of a lion or a pig. Now, of course it sounds awful to say this about people, but what he's really trying to say, I think it's actually compassionate. And he actually says these actions are not as evil as vice, all right? They're not as evil as vice. You're not as culpable in the sense of culpability. Something has happened to you. You were raised in a bad culture. You have an illness, or you maybe have been sexually abused, and you have developed natural desires that take away your free will, much like addiction. We accuse people, we say, of course, you never should have gone there, or you knew they were taking drugs, and you never should have taken drugs, and you never should have continued taking drugs, so you became an addict. But once you're an addict, we don't necessarily hold you morally culpable for each act you do, because you no longer have control of your will. So he talks again of brutishness in the next one. If you look in 1299, the second frame on page 3, the highlighted portion, it says, we'll start 2 lines before, it says, consequently, the affections of the sensitive part are sometimes perverted in man, almost like dumb animals, and this is called brutishness, exceeding human vice and incontinence. Right? In the next page, 1301, he says that in the highlighted part, brutish perversity is a kind of vice different from human vice, which is vice in the unqualified sense. So I need to leave some time for question and answer, and I hope you can go through these passages. But I believe what he's saying again, that the big question arises is that how do you help those with corrupt complexiones achieve the good life? I have several male friends, one that I've been friends with for 40 years, who has always been a believing and to some extent a devout Catholic, who has gone in and out of the gay lifestyle. and he belonged to Courage. He's gone for psychological counseling, just about everything you can do. He grew up in a devout Catholic household with a mean mother and an abusive father. 2 of his brothers are also homosexual. One is not. They don't believe it's biological. They believe it's because of the abuse from their father. And my friend was sexually abused by an older cousin when he was a teenager. And he said he himself just was ignited with these desires and started chasing after older men. And many of them say it's a father wound, that you have never been loved or embraced by your father. So you want the love of a male, and it becomes sexualized. They will give you love in return for sex. So what do you do with this person? Again, we've heard in a couple of sessions, and most of us know from our study of Aquinas, that getting good habits builds virtue, and you can order your disordered desires. If you're given into fornication, first you improve your intellect, you read about marriage, and you realize what a wonderful state it is, and your behavior is incompatible. That might be the first thing you do, but you get yourself out of occasional sin. You don't go where your friends are going to get girls. You pray more. You get a devotion to Mary, cold showers, all sorts of things you do in order to discipline your out of order desires. But these are not unnatural desires. The human intellect and the human will are designed to be able to order natural desires that have become disordered. But the human intellect and will are not designed, so far as I can tell what Aquinas is saying, to combat unnatural desires. They're too big for us, right? And so what do? I don't know. Thomas doesn't talk about it. Aristotle doesn't talk about it. But so far as I can tell, the only way you can do it is to put on Christ, as one of the earlier talks said. You have to become, and everyone that has ever managed, that I've read or talked to, that has managed to get out of being an active homosexual, have only done it by becoming a devout Christian, right? And being a devout Catholic is easier because there's all the sacraments, right? There's a tradition of spiritual direction. You go to Mass every day, you say the rosary, you join a support group, you have a spiritual director. But what you're trying to do is fall in love with Jesus. And as one man has told me, he's done it in a film, the film The Desire of the Everlasting Hills. There's an older man in there, Paul Darrow, who he says he had thousands of sexual partners in his lifetime. And he was watching Mother Angelica one day on TV, and she was talking about how God even loves those who have had thousands of sexual partners. He says, that's me. And so he was walking by a church. He'd been raised Catholic, and he said, I think I'll go in, right? And he ended up going to confession, and he tells me he never wants to do anything that would make him unqualified to receive the Eucharist, right? And that is what's ordering his desires. And I think it's not ordering his desires. They're not ordered. He's not heterosexual, right? They're not ordered. They're still disordered, but they've put them at peace. They've, if you want to say, repressed. But now he has an inner state of peace because of his love for Christ. And so again, it's much like the rest of the heterosexuals, you see something tempting, and what do? You turn away, sometimes because of your loyalty to your spouse, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they turn away because I love Jesus, and I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize that relationship. So I think it's infused virtue. There may be other things. I'd be happy to hear what any of the rest of you think. So that's my whole 2 minutes for question and answer here.
Thank you very much. If we can keep the questions really succinct, I think we can get 2 in. First, yellow tie. Yeah.
You might have to help me. I'm very hard of hearing. Okay.
I've been looking into the concept of the notion of complexio from a different angle. But
okay.
Questions of concern disability, and individuating bodily differences or inequality.
Right.
So Thomas uses, when he talks about integral human nature in the pre-lapsarian state, he talks about differences of size, strength, normativity, carnal beauty, and a complexio in describing the human body. So here's my question. One is the exegetical element. What is Aquinas thinking? How is he using this concept? The next one is how is that concept used for us today? Can it be used? On the exegetical point, yes, it's there, and it's there because he's presuming the Galenic the theory of the humors. So Complexio, that's how it fits, that's how it works. So on Aquinas' terms, because that's what he presumed, that's how he was working, that's how he was interpreting Aristotle. That was the best science of his day, and so he used that concept. So we can recognize it, how it functions there, both in the state of innocence and the state of corruption. There's that, and then there's how we interpret and use that category today. So on the exegetical point, I think you're right. Like that it's there, you can't get around it on Aquinas' terms because he presumes it. On the contemporary question, we don't use a theory of the humors. So how do you translate that concept, an ancient medical concept, to today?
Well, there are people who write on the temperaments, and I think they do a great job. But that's for all of us, not those who have a corrupt complexio. That's just, we're all born with a set of temperaments, and a prominent one and a secondary one. And learning that about yourself can help orient yourself towards the world very brilliantly. So I think and a lot of people line it up with a Myers-Briggs test, etc. But as far as, what I'm learning from this, of course, I don't accept James Martin's understanding of homosexuality and his approach. But this whole notion that and I don't want to use all modern jargon, but we're talking about very wounded human beings, all right? I don't think their state, the complexio, is a result of their choice. They may have made some very bad choices as a result of their complexio, but I'm not certain how much free will they have in respect to that. So we have to know who we're dealing with. And I think complexio helps us. They feel, many of them, that they're not in control of this. They don't have control. And I don't think that's an erroneous judgment, all right? And part of the reason they give up and join the whole gay community and gay pride and everything is they don't think there's anything else for them to do, all right? And we have to somehow get them, not like Martin, who's basically God loves you as you are, whatever that means. God loves you, all right, as a beloved son of God, and he wants you with him for an eternity. That's his plan for you. But it means you are going to have to give up this behavior, all right? How best to do it? And this isn't, what I'm talking about isn't pray the gay away, all right? Because pray the gay away means that somehow you can be miraculously formed into a heterosexual, right? There's nothing of that in what Aquinas is talking about here. And again, there's not much about it as what you do anyway. But what I'm understanding when I look some of the infused virtue is that the infused virtue will take over your system. And again, Christ is in charge more than your own will. Christ becomes the captain of your ship, right? But you have to, it just doesn't happen like that. God can do that, but for most people it's going to be, again, daily mass, daily rosary, adoration, confession, spiritual direction. And you can live what, objectively speaking, is a chaste life without having ordered your disordered passions, because they can't be ordered. That's disordered, unnatural passions. It's their nature. They can't be made natural.
Father, would you like the final question?
Have you looked into the question of the honor in Aquinas?
You're speaking Latin.
Honor.
Honor. Some. Go ahead.
There's an American thinker from Ghana. His name is Kwame something else. The name escapes me at the moment.
Okay.
Who wrote about moral revolutions, the abolition of dueling in 19th century Europe.
Okay.
The abolition of slavery in the British Empire, and the abolition of foot binding in China, which was done for millennia. And in each of these cases, the change came about with a sense of honor when the Chinese discovered through the missionaries that the whole world was making fun of them because they were binding the foot of girls.
It's very good.
And then quickly, this practice was abolished. And he sees here the honor code that became dishonorable. Now, Aquinas does speak about honor, and we normally dismiss that, we think it's medieval. But the social context and the understanding that this is dishonorable
Yeah.
helps the person
That's a
who
very-
has this complexity.
It's a very good suggestion. When I was in Ireland once, I was asked to be on a radio show, questions about homosexuality, and the moderator apparently had just told the priest that took me to the radio station that morning that he was getting out of the homosexual lifestyle. And he says, it's just too depraved. But that has a sense of that. I'm better than this, all right? I have honor, all right? I have dignity. And a little bit my approach here takes agency away from people, and you want another way to give them agency. Though the agency is probably not going to be so much control over their desires, but the agency is the desire to put myself in a state where I no longer act this way. Thank you. Thank you for your tolerance, and I'm sorry I took anything.
Friends, please join me in thanking Professor Smith. For those of you that joined us halfway through the talk, if you're standing, we have many seats up front if you're inclined, but if you want to hang out there, that's certainly at your discretion. Our next presentation will be delivered by two individuals. First of all, Ingrid de Groot is a graduate student concentrating in liturgical theology in the University of Notre Dame's Masters of Theological Studies program. Her research centers primarily on life transition rituals, such as marriage and funerals, and on theological anthropology in literature and liturgy. Between Notre Dame and her undergraduate studies, she worked in education, poverty alleviation ministry, and publishing in Montana and Washington. To my right, Patrick Mitchell is part of the upper school faculty at Sacred Heart Academy in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he teaches mathematics, science, and the trivium. He graduated from Hillsdale in 2021 with a bachelor's degree in philosophy. He is a longtime devotee of St. Thomas Aquinas, and his interest areas include Trinitarian theology and the philosophy of the human person. Ingrid and Patrick's paper is entitled Making a Match: Trinitarian Appropriation and the Sexes in Jane Austen's Novels.
Thank you all. I'm very excited to be here today. As Heather mentioned, I am a middle and high school teacher by trade, so I'm playing hooky to be here today. So I'm grateful to my school for giving me the time off to attend and to present to you all. All right, so to the question at hand today. What is the excellence of a man, and what is the excellence of a woman? It is a very simple question, but a very difficult question. And yet, despite its difficulty, it's a very important question. For as the Catechism says, our sexuality and the nature of sexual difference, as clearly expressed in the body, touches all aspects of the person in the union of his body and soul. And so, answering what it means not only to be human, but what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, is as essential to our common project as any other question that we are faced with. Except when we try to verbalize what exactly constitutes masculinity and femininity, we realize that it is a quite thorny approach, right? And any answer has to encompass two different realities, namely the shared humanity of the sexes and yet the real distinction of the sexes. And so when we attempt to verbalize this difference, we arrive at the problem, namely how do we distinguish masculinity and femininity to avoid a reduction to androgyny, without excluding true human excellences from one gender or another. So to take a very facile example, if we characterize masculinity as courageous strength, we don't want to imply suddenly that women do not have that capacity, nor are not called to that capacity. And so properly characterizing the genders becomes very difficult. And so when pursuing a solution, I've listed 4 criteria that a solution must have in order to be a proper one. So first, it must provide a real distinction between the sexes. If it doesn't, then we are reduced to the state of androgyny, and we have not actually answered the question at hand. Second, it must preserve our common humanity. And so any solution that attempts to consider masculinity and femininity, or men and women, as 2 entirely separate categories also misses the mark. Thirdly, it must be non-arbitrary. And so we want to have some method of characterizing masculinity and femininity that is not simply the product of a particular culture, time, and place. And lastly, most important for Thomas, it must be true to reality. Right? It must actually capture something that is real and present. And so Ingrid and I found that a satisfactory solution to this question is the methodology of appropriation as found in Trinitarian theology. And so to work through what this methodology entails, I'm going to provide a brief explanation of Trinitarian appropriation, justify why it can be applied to masculinity and femininity, provide some examples of what this might look like. What does it mean to appropriate virtues to one or the other? And then finally, hand it over to Ingrid de Groot to illustrate this method and its utility in the novels of Jane Austen. So to begin, a brief overview of what actually is Trinitarian appropriation for those who are unfamiliar. I want to say at the outset that I am very indebted to the work of Father Gilles Emery in this regard. He is a tremendous scholar in the Trinitarian theology of Thomas Aquinas, and so I draw much from him. So Trinitarian appropriation is a medieval articulation of a fairly common practice in the early church, whereby an essential attribute or act of God is appropriated or said of one member of the Trinity rather than another. And at first, this seems to be a very difficult or complicating act because, for example, if we were to say that the Father is the creator of heaven and earth, as we do every single Sunday in the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, to say that the Father is creator is not to deny that the Son or the Holy Spirit is the creator, or we would like it not to be, but rather it is taking something that is common of God in his essence and saying it of the Father for a particular purpose. And as Aquinas explains in the Summa Theologiae, what we call appropriation is the, quote, disclosure of the persons through the essential attributes. And so the real goal of appropriation is to reveal what is distinct about that person, what is really distinct about that person, by means of something that is common to the members. And so, for example, with Father as creator, the Father, the real distinction that sets apart the Father from the Son and the Holy Spirit is his eternal begetting of the Son. And so to appropriate creation to the Father and to see God as the origin of all created things allows us to have this sense of what it means to have the Father as the principle or the origin, obviously eternally, of the uncreated Son, the begotten. And so the purpose of appropriation is didactic, right? It reveals the distinction of the persons by means of what is common. And so there's a couple things that I just want to make sure that we get clear. First of all, it's non-arbitrary. And so the method of appropriation depends upon the congruity of the essential attribute with the real distinction. In addition, it's not modalism or a reduction to modalism for that very purpose. It assumes the real distinction and relies upon the real distinction, for example, for the Father as the begetter, the eternal begetter, in order to actually apply the appropriation at all. And so we're not saying that the Father is a mode of God as creator, but rather that we are taking an essential attribute, applying it to the Father for the sake of revealing what actually distinguishes him from the other persons. And so when we turn to the genders, we see that the same issue is at play, right? We have this commonality in nature and yet a real distinction. And so just as appropriation solves the issue of how do we apply what is common to what is distinct, so too can we apply the language of appropriation to the genders. And so first of all, the analogy holds because men and women have a common human nature. Now, I don't believe that to be a very controversial point, so I'm not going to elaborate on it at length. But it is consistently affirmed in the Christian and Catholic tradition. Now, it's important to note that I'm not saying that we have the numerical or substantial unity as exists in the Trinity, but there is still a commonality in nature that allows us to take what is common and the attributes and the excellences of what is common and apply it to what is distinct. Now, obviously, because we don't have this substantial oneness, there is a great degree of flexibility that is required of us because no one individual human being will perfectly exhaust our nature or what it means to be human. And so we're really going to have to look to a community of persons to get a sense, to get a flavor of what humanity truly is. In addition to this common nature, we also have a real distinction. And as scholar John Finley clarifies, the real distinction between the sexes is in the generative power of the soul. And so there is a commonality in all other powers of the soul, in the intellectual power. We have a common makeup in the will and the intellect and in the nature of our created bodies. And yet, as reflected by our bodies, there is this distinct mode of one particular power, namely the generative power. And the generative power is the power of the soul that concerns the capacity of the human person to create or reproduce something with a nature of like kind. And so what John Finley points out is that man and woman have this co-generative relationality. They require another, especially in the biological process, to accomplish the end of reproduction. And so this distinction allows us to define, in the same way in which the Trinitarian distinctions define the persons, to define what really constitutes man and woman. And so for man, John Finley modifies the Aristotelian and Thomistic definition of man and woman. But man is someone who co-generates outside of himself, right? The process of generation takes place outside. And woman is that which co-generates within herself. The more colloquial way of saying this is, if you have co-generated outside of yourself, then you become a father. And if you have co-generated within yourself, then you have become a mother. And so what we see is that the distinguishing feature of masculinity and femininity, the real distinction, is that of motherhood and that of fatherhood. And so once again, we are required to have a tremendous amount of flexibility, because this distinction doesn't carry the level of a subsistent relation as we see in the members of the Trinity, in the persons of the Trinity. And so just as no one human being exhausts human nature, so too does no one man or woman exhaust what it means to be masculine or feminine. And yet this distinction in the generative power distinguishes the one from the other. All right, so we can apply appropriation to human excellences in order to begin to disclose what it means to be a mother and father, to highlight those real distinctions. And so I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on what that might look like. So as you can see in your handout, we give some examples of appropriated virtues. Now, I want to say that these are chosen as representative samples. And so they are not the only virtues that you can select, and they are also not exhaustive of the virtues that can go through this process. But to emphasize once again, what this process entails is taking something that is common to human nature, so a properly human excellence, and applying it, just as you saw in the Trinity, applying it to one of the genders in order to disclose what makes that gender unique. And so for the feminine, we could appropriate the virtue, the human excellence of receptivity. And the appropriate way to understand receptivity is an action that involves the invitation of another into one's own sphere for the end of protecting and nourishing the person received, so that this process of growth and development might unfold without interference or threat of danger. Just to emphasize that this is a properly human trait and not one that is exclusive to the genders, I think a representative example of receptivity is Christ's welcoming of the woman caught in adultery. So what does Christ do in this action of receptivity? He defends the woman from external threat. He carves out a space in which to receive the woman as she is, and then through this mutual encounter allows for this process of growth and development. And yet, as a proper human excellence, it can be appropriated to femininity because of the congruity between the virtue of receptivity and the nature of motherhood. And I'd like to just highlight a couple aspects of this congruity. First is there is a radical invitation that is required both of motherhood and this act of receptivity. The inviting of another life within one's own sphere and all of the demands and risks that entails. And so obviously in biological motherhood, there's an intense vulnerability of the invitation of a life and the nurturing of that new life within oneself. And yet, in the context of a more spiritual motherhood, in conversation, in counseling, in all of these various manners, there is a way in which the act of mothering invites all of these risks, both of the vulnerable life and of the threat to oneself through that invitation. Lastly, the fruits mirror motherhood as well. And so just like in motherhood, the creation is of a like kind to the mother. The fruit of receptivity is an invitation of another person in, and the creation and the formation of a life that is in accordance with that environment. And so for these reasons, there is a congruity between receptivity, even though it is a human excellence, and femininity that serves the didactic purpose of revealing to us what actually constitutes femininity in motherhood. Now, for the masculine, we've decided to appropriate the human excellence of challenge. And the act of challenge is an act where an individual identifies an absence of some excellence external to themselves. They recognize the potential, though, for that excellence, and they work to call it forth from the other. And so again, just to emphasize, this is a truly human excellence. I think a proper example of this is the life of St. Catherine of Siena. Right? We are at a Thomistic conference. It's appropriate to cite a lay Dominican in this regard. But she had the gumption to challenge the Pope himself in recognizing an absence, a lack of ecclesiastical unity, and the desire to call it forth once again. And so, despite that, though, we can see a congruity between the act of challenge and masculinity, because it is a desire to realize the potential for life in another, external to oneself. Just as the real distinction of masculinity is the capacity to co-generate outside of oneself. And this act of calling out goodness in another requires the self-gift, the external self-gift, gift of one person to another for the sake of creating and generating a life, again, like oneself, in the image that one desires, for the sake of creating something new and good. And so we can see a congruity between the masculine act of challenge and the real distinction that distinguishes men from women. And so what we find is that this application of appropriation to the sexes accomplishes our four characteristics that we set out at the beginning, right? It provides a real distinction. It allows for a preservation of our common humanity because we constantly assert that these are truly human excellences. It is non-arbitrary because it depends upon a congruity between the virtue assigned and the real distinction that we elaborated upon. And we can see that because of the careful discernment of this process of appropriation, we can allow it to be attuned to reality, the realities of the men and women in our lives and the diversity that we find there. And so it allows us to have the flexibility required of our language as well. And so rather than erasing sex differences, appropriation gives us the language to see the commonality and the difference of the sexes in a single gaze, beautifully, I think, by appealing to the life of the Trinity. Now, there's no better way to see this than enacted in story. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author and co-presenter, Ingrid de Groot, to see this in the life and works of Jane Austen.
Thanks, Patrick. So despite our disagreements with Judith Butler, there's something really true. I'm going to lap this. In her statement that gender is in some real way an expression, a practice, quote, of improvisation within a scene of constraint. So we thought that providing literary examples makes it a little bit easier to grasp the implications of a philosophical theological framework and to understand the improvisatory nature of gender expression when we're talking about characters and specific people. I do want to emphasize that we're not making a literary argument when we're talking about Jane Austen here. I was talking to a visiting professor of theology and literature last week and he said it's more difficult for English and literature people to procure the requisite knowledge base to discuss theology accurately and helpfully, but it's more difficult for theologians to understand the methodology of literary analysis. So I'm not presuming to do this here. To say that Jane Austen is suggesting the theological anthropology in these books. But to some degree, she does seem to operate within it, and so her stories can illustrate the framework. We chose Austen because she's familiar and she's a good character writer. Her characters have a reality. They're both admirable and infuriating. And she provides some clear instantiations of gender expression that illustrate these given virtues. So the two characters we picked are Fanny Price, to illustrate a generous receptivity to goodness in other people, and Mr. Knightley, because some of his most memorable moments are arguments with Emma, in which he challenges her to be a compassionate and sensitive woman. There are summaries in the handout of the stories in case you're a little bit fuzzy on the details. Hopefully that will help. Fanny might be surprising because she's mousy. She's insufferably willing to be put upon. It's super annoying. She doesn't have Lizzie Bennet's spunk, and she's not brave and level-headed like Eleanor Dashwood. But though she's annoying, she does express a pretty strong version of femininity, not just because she exhibits these maternal co-generation within virtues that we've argued are appropriate to our understanding of femininity, but because she does it with conviction and she does it effectively. So although she's submissive, she's really remarkably firm. Though she's gentle and receptive, she recognizes and resists the disingenuousness of the Crawford siblings. And though she is, according to Edmund and Sir Thomas, an exemplary model of femininity for her agreeableness and her persuadability, she steps into masculine virtues, masculine because they co-generate without, of challenge, protection, and provision to preserve and cultivate what is just and good within herself and within her sphere. So the ways in which Fanny is particularly receptive have to do with her receptivity to moral formation. Edmund admonishes her, and she takes it in and she internalizes it and acts upon it. She's receptive to goodness in nature. This is an essay for another time, but all of Austen's good characters really, really like the natural world, and all of her bad characters just sort of dismiss it. She's receptive to people, and that she gives herself in service. She's perceptive of their intentions. So she seeks to treat them humanely even when they abuse her, and she recognizes that they might actually be trying to help her even when they don't do it correctly. She also learns to invite others into her world, into her system of ethics and her appreciation of beauty. So she brings them in to give them what she has. The key point is that she demonstrates proper receptivity not only by opening herself to and taking in what is good and inviting others into it, but she eventually learns to assertively protect what is just and beautiful. At the beginning, Fanny and the Bertrams and the reader all kind of confuse her receptivity with submission and persuadability. Everyone uses her and conscripts her into service, but Fanny starts to learn the difference when the play situation happens. So the cousins decide that they're going to put on this very risque play that isn't appropriate for teenagers, or probably anyone else. And Edmund and Fanny both say, no, we're not going to. And Edmund eventually caves. And Fanny looks at this person who's been her moral rock, and she says, oh my gosh, his judgment can err too, but I'm not going to follow him. She says no because she knows it's wrong, because she's been properly formed and she's going to hold on to it. And then it happens again with Mary when Edmund decides that he's going to explain away Mary's willfulness and her petulance because she had a bad upbringing, and so she can't really be blamed. And Fanny's like, well, she still shouldn't be acting this way. But it comes to a head when Sir Thomas and Edmund try to get her to marry Crawford. Both Edmund and Sir Thomas expect Fanny to accept Crawford's attentions because she's a grateful, tender-hearted, persuadable girl. And in accepting, Edmund tells her, quote, she would be the perfect model of a woman and submitting to Crawford's attentions. But Fanny, who's received caution and sound judgment into herself, now protects it and says no. She demonstrates a greater rationality and receptivity than Edmund can even understand. She's still generous and sensitive to Crawford's humanity and professed desire. She doesn't snub him or denigrate him. She just says no. She also doesn't resent her uncle and her cousin for trying to persuade her to marry him because she understands that their intentions are for her good. But again, she says no because they're wrong. So her receptivity and her sensitivity are not negated by her lack of submission. In fact, she's most truly receptive because she's discerning about what to receive and hold. Most truly a woman precisely because she does not simply submit, but rather preserves what is just and true. Here's where it gets a little bit more fun. Fanny's receptivity and sensitivity, which co-generate goodness and truth in her sphere, end up having the masculine force of co-generating outside herself in her sphere. Crawford initially plans to woo Fanny just because he wants to amuse himself. He says he wants to make a small hole in Fanny Price's heart. and toy with her, which is just so annoying. But as he gets to know her, he sees her praise and delight in what is good, and he begins to be attracted to what she admires and to desire what she desires. So Fanny's generous affection for and cultivation of what is good act as a challenge to Crawford to desire and live similarly. So by appropriating human virtue, this generous receptivity to herself, Fanny propagates goodness in herself to the benefit of herself and others, even outside of her sphere. She doesn't want to draw Crawford in, but it does challenge him to live in a more upright manner. Knightley's challenge in Emma is much more overt. So when we think of Emma and Knightley, we think of them arguing over Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, or Knightley's trying to get her to be a little bit more perceptive, a little bit more careful, stop sticking her foot in her mouth. And most famously at Box Hill, when he's just trying to get Emma to be baseline civil to Miss Bates. But I want to look at their argument over Harriet Smith and Robert Martin because it first introduces us as readers to this challenge relationship between Knightley and Emma, and it plants seeds of an honest relationality that bear fruit, basically as sanctification over the course of the novel. Emma is actually receptive and generous to Harriet in a way. Harriet is lower class. She doesn't have Emma's privilege and wealth or even her cleverness. And Emma wants to take her in and give her good things and make her a fine lady. But she isn't fully receptive to Harriet, and Mr. Knightley sees that. He knows that Harriet is a foil for Emma. By Harriet's manners and by her very presence, she sort of ratifies Emma's sense of her own superiority. He also knows that Emma is vain about her powers of perception and social engineering. She views Harriet as a locus of her control and creativity, which is fundamentally, obviously, an improper way to relate to Harriet as a human, let alone as a friend. So when Robert Martin proposes to Harriet, Emma is incensed. This threatens Emma because if Harriet goes off and marries Robert Martin, Emma has lost control. And because Emma's relationship with Harriet is actually contingent on Harriet continuing to participate in Emma's class sphere. So when Mr. Knightley says this is a good match, Emma's offended, and she's like, what? Think a farmer, a good match for my intimate friend, not regret her leaving Highbury for the sake of marrying a man whom I could never admit to an acquaintance of my own? Mr. Martin may be rich, but he undoubtedly is inferior to Harriet in her rank in society. The sphere in which she moves is much above his. It would be a degradation. And Mr. Knightley retorts, a degradation to illegitimacy and ignorance to be married to a respectable, intelligent farmer. So Mr. Knightley challenges her both on her class snobbery. Real gentility, he says, is sense, sincerity, and good humor, which Mr. Martin possesses in abundance. And second, he chastises her for not being truly generous and loving or friendly. True friendship would not condition a relationship on class, nor would it attempt to control the other's life. By the end of the novel, Knightley's exercise of authoritative challenge has drawn both real receptivity and generosity and humility out of Emma. Emma receives Harriet as a friend despite her low marriage. Emma has become humble about her powers of social engineering and learned where to locate true human worth. Emma also recognizes that she actually needed Knightley to confront her in order to get rid of her vanity and her snobbishness. She says, I doubt whether my own sense would have corrected me without your efforts. By appropriating authoritative challenge, Knightley not only calls forth a potential good in Emma that he sees in her, latent and unengaged, but because of this challenge, he and Emma together can heal, nurture, create greater stability and humanity and joy within their community. In a fun turn of events, this little role reversal, Emma actually challenges Knightley to be more receptive to Harriet. As a sensible, amicable woman, and by the end he is. So again, we're appropriating common human virtues. Here's the point. It is precisely Emma and Knightley's differences and conflict and their non-arbitrary appropriation of specific virtues that facilitate their, quote, perfect marriage of minds and constitute a fuller unity that allows them to draw one another into a generative complementarity. This generative complementarity propagates a fullness of humanity in another and proliferates generosity and security within their larger community. Leaning into their differences in nature, in experience, and intellectual approaches, they become fruitful. This dynamic complementarity, I think, is a major point for Austen, and it's also the main point of our Trinitarian appropriation analogy here, that understanding the differences in men and women helps us see the fullness of humanity in men and women individually, and understand how their distinctiveness, put in relation, propagates more humanity and goodness in the world as a whole. And I think I'm like way out of time. So are there any questions? I think we have a couple minutes.
If we can, we have
One
time for
question?
one very brief question with the, yep, go ahead.
So I'm curious what you were just saying about gender complementarity, and I wanted to ask you what you think that this would look like outside of mere biological generation. So like specifically within the context of like religious life or non-sexual relations between men and women.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, Knightley and Emma provide a good example of that because they get married eventually, but we're not talking about the children they have. We're talking about how they challenge one another and receive one another in ways that makes them more virtuous humans. Does that make sense? It's kind of, sort of. Feel free to talk to me about it afterward if you want.
Wonderful. Thank you very much again, Patrick and Ingrid.